10 years ago, my dad passed away. Natural causes, but sudden, it hit us hard. About a month after the funeral, I was asked if I wanted a few boxes of his things. Mom and Dad divorced when my sister and I were kids. He lived across the country, so we only saw him on weekends, and only when he wasn't working. He was a workaholic. Didn't have much time for us growing up. When it came time to divide up his stuff, Mom told me I could have all 3 boxes. Those boxes sat untouched in my living room for a week. Opening them meant accepting he was really gone. When I finally cut the tape, it was as emotional as I imagined. His childhood stuff. Baseball cards. Old photos of him and my aunt as kids. A vintage Fender Stratocaster in its case, worth thousands by now. An expensive tailored shirt from New York. And then, the laptop case. Mid-90s, at least. Real leather. Well designed. I decided to refurbish it, use it for my own laptop. But first, I needed to empty all the pockets. Receipts in one pouch. Old Italian lira in another. And then, an envelope. The name on it wasn't my dad's. Just said honey. I figured it was from Mom, back before the divorce. Something to remind me they were actually in love once. I opened it. Inside were photos. Nude photos. I dropped that envelope like it was radioactive. I started reading the letter anyway. Figured I'd stop when it got spicy, then burn everything. But right away, something felt wrong. The handwriting wasn't Mom's. The date said they were still married, but nothing made sense. Places they'd supposedly been together, California, that I'd never heard them mention. Halfway through, I knew for certain, this wasn't Mom. I looked at the photos. The woman definitely wasn't my mother. My dad had been cheating on Mom. And if I was right, that's what caused the divorce, not the irreconcilable differences they'd cited. The only thing I didn't understand, why did Mom never mention it? She talked trash about Dad all the time after the divorce. Why keep the affair secret? Either she wanted to protect us, which seemed unlikely, or she genuinely didn't know. And I did not want to be the one to tell her. The woman signed the letter with a shortened version of a fairly common name. So, I tried Google, her name plus Dad's old company, specific departments, accounting, human resources. I got hits. But not company pages. News articles. A woman who worked at Dad's company had gone missing in the early 90s. I found an article with her picture. No doubt anymore, she was the same woman in those photos. The one Dad had the affair with. She disappeared. I called Mom with a strange request. I needed to ask her something about Dad, but she couldn't ask follow-up questions. Not until I was sure. Luckily, she wasn't interested in hearing what I'd found. I asked about the time period when the affair partner went missing. Did she remember anything unusual about Dad around then? You're asking me about 20 years ago. I can barely remember last week. I asked her to think about it. Call me back if she remembered anything. A couple days later, she called. Now she was focused on asking why I'd asked that question. I told her I didn't want to explain until I knew more, didn't want to worry her if it turned out to be nothing. She reluctantly accepted, as long as I promised to tell her when it was over. What she remembered, Dad was working constantly back then. Something at his job was getting him down. He seemed stressed, losing sleep, not eating properly. Then one day he announced an impromptu hiking vacation to de-stress. Company team building exercise. Pretty much mandatory. He seemed as happy about it as he could be, given his state of mind. Gone 3 or 4 days. Mom thought he'd come back improved. But he was worse than ever. Slept an entire day when he got home. Moody and distant for days after. Took weeks of taking it easy at work to get back to his regular self. Mom realized, thinking back, that was the beginning of the end of their marriage. Dad was never the same. She filed for divorce just over a year later. She was very interested to know what I'd found. Her voice very concerned. What the heck have you found? I told her I had a few more loose ends to tie up. Then I'd give her the full breakdown. I warned her, it would be upsetting at best, terrifying at worst. She sounded as scared as I was when she said okay. The next morning, I called the cops. I have information regarding a missing persons case from the early 90s. I handed over the love letter connecting the missing woman to my dad. Told them everything Mom had said, how Dad had been acting weird around the time the woman disappeared. But I don't think it helped much. They needed hard evidence, not anecdotal stuff. It was the most surreal, heartbreaking, depressing thing I've ever done, reporting my own father for potentially being a murderer. But if it helped solve this poor woman's case, who probably had family out there hoping she was alive, I had to do it. Didn't I? Nothing came of it. Dad was never announced as a suspect. The cop called back once to confirm details for my statement. They never called again. That part was easy. Telling Mom about the affair and the missing woman? That was anything but. It was one thing to find out he'd been cheating. But the possibility he'd been involved in her disappearance? That was something else entirely. I watched Mom sink into depression for a while. It didn't matter if he was involved. The secret life she didn't know about. Him grieving some lover in secret. And that was the best case scenario. In the worst case, she'd been sharing her bed with a murderer for a year after. Now I had just lived with this in my head. It doesn't mean Dad murdered that woman. It just means the cops haven't been able to prove it conclusively. That's my biggest fear, that one day I'll get a call saying I helped solve the murder my own father committed and kept secret. Long time ago now, I went to stay with relatives over the holidays. Late Christmas Day, the party was winding down. Sitting with my uncle and a few others, finishing off a bottle or two. My aunt and uncle's kitchen was decorated almost entirely with pictures of themselves and my cousins. We spent quite a while looking at each, reminiscing or harmlessly poking fun. We were laughing at one picture. My uncle's 70s hair was absolutely hilarious. He took it in good humor, got up, "If you think that's funny, wait until you see Aunt Janie's hair from the 80s. She thought she was Grace Jones. Aunt Janie, you're a dead man if you bring those photo albums down." He didn't listen. Somehow lived to see another day. Aunt Janie's hair was cool as hell, by the way. Since my uncle brought down a whole box of photo albums, we started passing them around. I found myself flicking through one with much older photos. In one photo, a man I first mistook for Uncle Steve was standing in a church, wearing some kind of ceremonial Catholic robe. Admittedly, I was pretty drunk. First thing out of my mouth, "Holy crap, Uncle Steve, when were you a priest?" He was pretty drunk too. For a second, "I've never been." Then he shot me this look, like he'd just done something he shouldn't. He wasn't mean or aggressive, but he quickly took the album away. "I think we've seen enough from this one." I wondered why he was embarrassed. But when Aunt Janie realized what was happening, she immediately rose, took the album, and returned it upstairs. When she came back, I asked what the deal was. She said she didn't want to spoil the evening. She'd tell me in the morning. Next morning, after a very hungover breakfast, I asked Aunt Janie about the photo. She sighed, "I was hoping you'd forgotten all about that." But she stayed true to her word. Put on a pot of coffee and started telling me the story. First thing to know, the man in the religious clothing wasn't Uncle Steve. It was his non-identical twin, Simon. They looked very similar but had taken very different paths. Simon went off to join the seminary after college. I thought it was odd I was only just meeting him. But over the next half hour, it made total sense why no one talked about him anymore. After graduating seminary, Simon ended up moving to Nebraska. Worked here on the East Coast for a while, then was offered some big shot job for the church in Lincoln. He stayed in Lincoln for around 10 years. Then one day, he forwarded Uncle Steve a new address and phone number. Steve thought he'd been promoted, so he called to congratulate him. But Simon hadn't been promoted. He'd retired from the church. He wasn't some senior. He was in his mid-30s. Uncle Steve thought Simon sounded weird on the phone. Drove all the way out to see him at his new place to make sure he was okay. Simon was not okay. Drinking heavily. Said he'd lost his faith. Basically given up on the world. Steve figured it was some kind of early onset midlife crisis. Stayed with him till he got his drinking under control. Once Simon was on his feet, Steve drove home and monitored him by phone instead. Calls went from daily to every couple days to once a week. By the time they were weekly, Simon was talking about writing a book and trying to get it published. He had savings from his church work. Since he seemed stable, Steve figured Simon was over the worst of it. They kept in touch, just not regularly. Then one day, Uncle Steve called and Simon wasn't answering. He got so worried he drove out to Nebraska to check on him personally. When he arrived, he found Simon had passed away in his sleep. Steve said finding his brother's body was the worst thing that ever happened to him. He was focused on reporting the death to the cops and not compromising what might be a crime scene. Didn't take a detailed look around Simon's house. Meaning he and his family had to wait a week or two to get the full picture of what caused his death. First thing Steve found out, Simon died from liver disease caused by drinking. He'd apparently started up again in secret. Then, once they were clear to collect his belongings, Steve found out why Simon had started drinking again. It was all to do with that book he was writing. This was the early 90s. Simon had one of those electronic word processors. Steve took it home, asked it to print what was stored on it. It printed everything Simon had written over the past couple weeks. Simon's book was about his time in the church. But it read like a confession. That big high-profile job in Lincoln? Essentially a public relations role. Maintaining good relations between the Catholic Church and the people of Nebraska. But this PR role was unlike any other. The specifics involved visiting families of children who had been abused by priests. Convincing them not to take legal action. He did this by telling them the offending priests would be moved. Also by offering them pretty measly amounts of cash, considering these kids would be scarred for life. If they didn't comply, he'd move on to threatening them with countersuits. Telling them it'd be much easier and less costly to just move on. This didn't happen once every few years. There were a lot of these cases for Simon to deal with. Sometimes one family a week. Sometimes two if the schedule got congested. He wasn't just confined to Nebraska either. He traveled to surrounding states, using either the carrot or the stick to convince these poor victimized families to take the money and shut up. For the good of the church. The way they justified this was absolutely nightmarish. There was a running narrative among certain priests that the kids were responsible for tempting the clergy. That the encounters were consensual. I can't even begin to wrap my head around that disgustingly perverted logic. The next group thought certain parents were just trying to get money out of the church. Simon wrote that certain people, himself included, didn't doubt there were legitimate cases. But they also believed the Michael Jackson hypothesis, that one legit case sparked dozens of fake ones, each set of parents only looking for a payout. That one was easier for people to believe. Then there were the priests who straight up believed all the cases were legitimate but didn't care. To them, the overall benefits of the church outweighed the negatives of the abusing priests. Simon lasted in that job for 10 years. A whole decade of ensuring evil didn't get punished. Then one day it caught up with him. He'd been living in his messed up predatory echo chamber for so long that when he finally saw the light, it drove him crazy. Turned him into a major alcoholic. I get it, too. If one day you realized you'd been legitimately enabling evil to exist in the world, what else is there to do but isolate yourself, drink yourself into a stupor, and wait around to die? You failed at life in one of the worst ways possible. I don't think people can come back from something like that. Once they found out what Simon really did for a living, Uncle Steve dealt with it by not talking about it. He didn't do therapy. He just shut Simon away in a box somewhere in his mind and pretended he didn't even have a brother anymore. Simon was just some guy he happened to grow up with who no longer deserved any thought. I asked if Steve had maybe forgotten the picture was there, or if he kept one last picture to remember him by. Aunt Janie said it was definitely the latter. Steve knew that picture was in that album. Wouldn't have mattered if he was blackout drunk, he wouldn't have brought it downstairs unless for some reason he wanted us to see it. We figured it might be a cry for help. All that feeling bubbling up after all those years. To my knowledge, he never talked about it. Maybe he did with my aunt and asked her not to broadcast what he said. But I hope he did. It's not healthy to keep that kind of pain buried inside. Not healthy at all. I can't be too generous with details, this is very personal for me and my immediate family. I grew up in the United Kingdom to a very moderate Muslim family. By very moderate, none of my sisters wear hijabs. We own Christmas jumpers and have Christmas dinner. I only go to mosque maybe once a year around Eid. We pray 5 times a day, preferably together as a family. We abstain from booze and bacon. Mom loves cooking Italian, she so wants to be Italian, but always uses halal meat. The same applies to my extended family. This story is about a member of that extended family. September last year, 2024, me and my sister were reminiscing over Snapchat. Got talking about a party when I was 6 and she was 8. How we fell out because I refused to wear a different colored dress than her. I laughed about how petty we were. Then I had this weird kind of flashback, saw an older boy's face in some long dormant memory. I did a quick mental inventory. Counted all our cousins in my head. He was a spare. Couldn't quite remember if he was a relative or not. Me and my sister group texted Mom to settle it once and for all. The strangest thing happened. We knew this boy was real. All our brothers and sisters remembered who we were talking about. But when we asked Mom, she denied all knowledge. We texted, was he this Andy's son or that Andy's son? Thinking Mom would suddenly remember, oh yeah, I remember now. She didn't. Just kept saying she didn't remember. It got kind of weird. Next time I was home, I went through all the family albums trying to find a photo of the boy. Lots of old photos. Birthday parties. Eid celebrations. I didn't see that older boy's face anywhere. Got to the point where I started to feel a bit mental. But I knew I wasn't just imagining stuff. I asked Dad if he remembered who I was talking about. He started acting very, very cagey. Got this almost frightened look about him. Couldn't hide the nervousness in his voice. "Have you asked your mom?" Might as well have said that spy thing, I can neither confirm nor deny. Basically an admission that something had happened. I knew something weird was going on when he too offered only a very cagey denial. I might have uncovered some kind of family conspiracy, but I hadn't traveled home for winter break just to play detective. Thought about it once or twice. Spoke to my sister, she agreed something weird was definitely going on. But it was only when Mom invited me to go through her books to see which ones I'd like to take back to uni that I accidentally blew the whole thing wide open. I was standing in front of Mom's bookcase, pulling books down to read the blurbs. After I pulled this larger hardcover out, I saw a photograph fall out from between the pages. A family photograph like many others in the house. Then I saw him. That spare boy from my memory of the party. I gasped when I saw his face. Looked a little younger than my memory, but it was definitely him. I had evidence of his existence right there in my hand. I found Mom in the kitchen. Showed her the photo. Asked her to please try and remember who he was. I didn't make demands, I knew she couldn't play dumb any longer. Asked her why the photo was in the book. She sighed. Took the photo from me. Said we needed to talk in private. Took me upstairs to my bedroom. Kind of a rush to have almost uncovered a clue. But whatever Mom was about to tell me didn't seem like good news. She told me the boy was an older cousin of mine. She'd just call him Zach. He'd moved away to university when I was just starting primary school. While he was there, something very tragic happened to him. I asked if Zach had passed away. Only felt more confused when Mom said we didn't know if he was with us or not. He was just missing. I understood why I hadn't been told until I needed to be told. But when I suggested visiting my auntie to pay my respects, Mom shook her head. I understood that parents protect their kids from certain painful truths. But I didn't understand when Mom said, using her words, "We don't talk about him anymore." I was very taken aback. A cousin of ours had disappeared while studying at uni and we just didn't talk about him anymore? I thought that was absolutely outrageous. I made a rare demand of my mom to tell me more. All she said, Zach had gone missing during his studies. We hadn't heard from him since. It was Mom's decision not to talk about him anymore. The family respected that by not having any photos of him around or in any albums. The last thing Mom and Dad wanted was to dredge up painful memories for her. Mom did hide that photo in the book. Never admitted it, but I knew, she couldn't bring herself to throw away every photo of Zach. All I wanted to know was why. Trying to get her to tell me only started a massive fight. We made up the next morning. Everything was fine till I went back to uni after winter break. When she dropped me off at the station, Mom warned me not to talk to my aunt about it. She understood I'd be curious, but she wasn't making it up, my aunt wouldn't want to talk about it. She made me promise I wouldn't try. I promised her. God forgive me, it was a promise I didn't keep. Sometimes I think I'd do just about anything to turn back the clock and properly honor that promise. The only clue Mom gave me about Zach's disappearance was the time of year it occurred. She told me Zach hadn't come home for winter break. That's when it all started, mid-December. I'd missed the anniversary by about 3 weeks. But I knew my aunt still had it on her mind. After getting dropped off at the station, I chose not to catch my train. Told myself I'd catch the next one, roughly 2 hours from then. In the meantime, I'd buy some flowers and drop them off at my aunt's house. I couldn't bear to think of her and my uncle dealing with all that heartache alone. But I couldn't be overt with my condolences. I decided to write, "I'm sorry, thinking of you in this difficult time," without signing my name. Leave them on their doorstep before disappearing into the night. I bought the flowers. Wrote the note. Caught the bus to my aunt's housing estate. Had my scarf up over my face. New woolly hat that neither my aunt nor uncle would recognize. Wrote the note in block capitals to throw them off. As much as I felt good about comforting them, things took a drastic turn for the worse. As quickly as that very next morning. Early next morning, I got a call from my aunt. The moment her name appeared on my phone screen, "Uh-oh." I answered, trying to sound innocent. Apologized for not calling around to visit while I had the chance. My auntie spoke. I knew I'd been found out somehow. She asked me, very seriously, if I'd left anything on her doorstep the previous evening. Since I couldn't lie to her, I admitted it. Yes, I did. I was scared she'd start screaming at me or tell my mom to do the shouting. She didn't. Instead, she asked if I was free to chat sometime that week. Waiting for her to arrive was really nerve-wracking. Horrible feeling it'd be. We're not angry, we're just disappointed, which is way worse than parents just being angry. When my aunt arrived, she seemed a lot more happy to see me than I thought she would be. She wasn't angry. Not even disappointed. There was just something really important I needed to know. She wasn't going to enjoy telling me. After getting comfortable and making cups of tea, my aunt asked me to fill her in on what I already knew. All I knew: Zach had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. To her, the circumstances weren't mysterious at all. The issue wasn't so much that he'd vanished. It was that Zach had let my aunt know exactly where he was and exactly what he was doing. When Zach first went missing, he wasn't responding to any texts or calls. He was supposed to arrive home on a Friday evening in December. When my aunt hadn't heard from him by midnight, she called the police. Something was wrong. She had this terrible feeling he'd had a car accident on an icy road. Dead in a ditch somewhere. Not even 24 hours passed before the police called back. They'd found Zach's car in an airport car park. My aunt went from relieved to worried again. Zach hadn't mentioned anything about flying anywhere. When she asked where he'd gone, police told her he'd flown out of the UK on the same day she reported him missing. He'd flown to Turkey. My aunt had next to no clue what he'd flown to Turkey for. He wasn't the type to jet off on some lad's holiday without saying anything. It wasn't like he'd have to conceal some romantic getaway. They didn't mind if he dated responsibly. Police said they'd be in touch. They were reaching out to Turkish authorities. Between then and when they called back, my auntie mentioned the disappearance to a friend. When she mentioned the word Turkey, her friend's face turned ashen. My auntie doesn't exactly keep up with current events. She had to have her friend fill her in on why Zach's trip to Turkey had alarmed her so much. She'd heard some stuff on the news about a terrorist group in the Middle East. But, without trying to sound flippant, when has that not been the case? Some of my earliest memories are watching the news and seeing soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. My aunt totally understood why she thought same crap, different day when she caught bits on the news. What she didn't realize, a significant number of young British men and women were using Turkey as a staging post to be smuggled into another country. Syria. These people, between ages 15 to 30, weren't off on holidays or romantic weekends. They were out to join a group which had been called many different things in many different countries. Here they were called ISIS. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. My auntie's family were very similar to ours. Very lax with their Islam. Zach was allowed to date. Went to the pub for a J20 after five-a-side football. As far as my auntie knew, he was about as far from an extremist as possible. So this Turkey thing was either a romantic getaway or, as my uncle suggested, a trip to Istanbul to watch his football team play away. My aunt wasn't in the least bit worried about Zach joining some terror group. But a few days later, she got a call from some kind of special constable who asked to visit her at home. My auntie is an oncology nurse. She knew it had to be bad news if the constable was delivering it in person. The policewoman revealed their findings gently and gradually. Like lowering her into a hot bath. Not all at once. A little bit at a time. Turkish authorities were able to determine that Zach had deplaned in Istanbul and immediately boarded another flight to a city closer to the Syrian border. They tracked his movements to a hotel in that same city. When they searched the room, they found it empty. Turkish police questioned the hotel staff. A young man matching Zach's description had been spotted meeting an older man in the lobby. Staff remembered it because one man spoke Arabic with a distinctly Syrian accent, while the other spoke it like he was still learning. Police were 90% sure it was Zach who'd met with the Syrian guy. There was a chance that was his guide to help him get into Syria. One of the reasons Zach might go to Syria, to join a terrorist organization. The policewoman in the UK didn't know if it was ISIS or the tons of other groups fighting against the Syrian government. But if he hadn't told my aunt, there was a good chance it'd be something she wouldn't approve of. Meaning there was a very distinct possibility Zach had joined ISIS. The policewoman broke it to her very gently. Said they didn't know for sure what Zach was up to. Asked my aunt to forward any emails or texts he might send. Details of any phone calls. I don't think they do that with regular missing person cases. That's what makes me think they already knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. My aunt refused to believe it. Spent a few days in blissful denial. Until an email finally appeared in her work inbox. From Zach. While he would have considered it an apology and explanation, the police considered it a typed confession. Zach didn't say exactly where he was or that he'd joined a particular group. Just said he was really sorry he didn't tell her. Knew she'd have stopped him if he did. Said he was fighting to protect the Syrian people from their government. Police later said Zach had most likely been coached on what to say. ISIS were doing what a lot of militaries do, getting recruits to email home to reassure friends and loved ones. It also served as a recruitment tool. It's really nice over here. That's just what Zach said. He was happy to be in the caliphate, the Arabic word meaning religious state. He'd been welcomed like a hero. His ISIS commander had given him and a few other British lads a week's free stay in a luxury hotel so they could acclimatize to the weather before their training started. After that week was up, he wouldn't be able to reply to any emails for a while. Something about secure connections. My aunt said he seemed to think that once he'd laid out his reasons, she might actually be proud of him. She wasn't proud. She was terrified. She sent him an email back telling him to come home as soon as he was able. He didn't reply for a couple weeks. When he did, my aunt said he sounded brainwashed. The things Zach said sounded so unlike him that my aunt thought someone else might have written it. Zach liked football, hip-hop, and was happy as Larry being at university with his mates. But in that email, he talked about jihad, martyrdom, and how much he hated the kufr, the Arabic word for unbelievers. He was misquoting scripture and religious rulings to excuse what he'd done. In response to my aunt saying she couldn't picture her little boy hurting anyone, he said he wasn't her little boy anymore. The people he hurt weren't people at all, so she shouldn't feel bad if he hurt or even killed them. At one point, Zach tried reassuring my aunt that not everyone he captured would be killed. For the most part, the women and kids he captured would either be kept as his own personal slaves or would make him rich after being sold in the slave markets. My aunt struggled to believe he'd written things like that. He didn't sound like her son at all. But there were certain phrases and nicknames he used that confirmed for her it had to be him. My aunt ended up crying her eyes out with that policewoman. The policewoman was struggling to hold back tears too. She was a mom too. Told my aunt she could barely imagine the pain she was going through. There was very little they could do at that point. Turkish authorities couldn't pursue him into Syria. The best my aunt could do was reply to the email, begging him to come home while tugging on his heartstrings. She did as the policewoman asked. Wrote him long heartfelt emails touching on his childhood, how much everyone loved him, how he wouldn't get into that much trouble if he just came home and cooperated with police. She had to wait weeks for another reply. When it came, she hoped what she'd said had gotten through to him. It hadn't. Quite the opposite. What Zach wrote was even worse than before. He'd completed his training in his first mission. His unit had been ordered to attack a Kurdish village in northern Syria. The defenders fought fiercely but were eventually overrun. All the civilians were gathered in one place. They separated the men from the women and kids. One by one, they dragged the men into an open field and cut their heads off. Zach said he personally beheaded a man who prayed to some other god before he was killed. Said that confirmed what he was doing was the right thing. They hadn't sent him to kill other Muslims but unbelievers. All that was obviously massively upsetting for my auntie. But the worst thing was the glee with which he wrote his email. Zach acted like killing people and forcing women and kids into slavery was his single greatest achievement. His one-way ticket to Jannah al-Firdaus, the highest tier of heaven. Even though there's tons of stuff in the Quran which tells us not to hurt innocent people, only aggressors who threaten us in our homelands. One quote is from verse 32 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, "Whoever takes a life, it will be as if they killed all of humanity. Whoever saves a life, it will be as if they saved all of humanity." My aunt wrote that into one of her emails. But Zach only addressed it in a roundabout way. Said people were misquoting the Quran to justify Muslims being weak and not defending themselves. It was like Zach was ignoring everything which told him to be peaceful in favor of any verse that might possibly justify terrorism and murder. It broke my auntie's heart so badly that I don't think she's ever going to fully recover. She emailed him back once again, begging Zach to come home. Then she waited for a reply that never came. That email talking about the attack and cutting people's heads off was the last time my auntie ever heard from Zach. According to people from the Home Office, they think it's more than likely Zach was killed. Either during an attack or from a bomb dropped on him. She'd once hoped he'd suddenly return home after ISIS's little terror kingdom fell apart. But he didn't. No emails. No texts or calls. Just dead silence on his end. He was never seen again. When she was done telling her story, my aunt asked if I understood why she didn't want to talk about him anymore. I did. I could understand why she was so ashamed, angry, and upset. Why she didn't want any pictures of him around too. Why she didn't want any pictures of him around to remind her. Zach was dead. And even if he wasn't, the boy she raised was long gone. It wasn't even that she'd purged all thoughts of him from her mind. She thought about him almost every minute of every day. She just didn't need anything to remind her of what her mind already tortured her with. This is probably the worst thing that's ever happened to me in terms of disgust and dread. And even worse, it continues to affect my family to this day. A while back, I started on the road of fulfilling my dream, opening up a daycare center. I don't want to say what state I'm in exactly. But the background checks and regulations are very, very strict. I'm not complaining too much about that. They should be if a person is trying to work with kids. But I had to wait months and months. Filling out all kinds of forms. Sending over all kinds of information. Part of the overall process was making sure there were no child predators living in the area where I wanted to open my daycare. There's a website you can use to find out where they live. I do not recommend using it. Holy crap, it is creepy to see just how many there are. But that's what I use to cross-reference potential sites. Make sure it wouldn't be near someone dangerous. It literally tells you these dudes' names in little info bubbles near their homes. I remember clicking on a couple. Still cringing about how many there were. Then after clicking on one of the little icons, I saw a guy who had the exact same last name as me. I don't want to say what that name is, I'm not trying to dox myself. Even if I didn't give a damn, I don't want people finding my family. But my point is, it's not Smith or Johnson or something common. It's actually very uncommon. I didn't recognize the guy's first name, so I was obviously very relieved. But since I couldn't reassure myself he wasn't family, because of the rarity of our name, I called my uncle to ask if I had a relative I didn't know about. The second I asked him, he said, "Who told you?" When I said no one had said anything to me, he told me he'd come over to talk about it in person. Turns out this offender guy was a relative of ours. The family had agreed to cut him off after the conviction, which by that point was almost 3 decades old. He'd already been released from prison. After his explanation, it was time for my own. He wanted to know how I'd found out after all the older generation agreed the younger should never find out. I told him about the whole daycare thing. How I needed to look up child predators. When I mentioned where he lived, my uncle got very mad. Apparently, they told him he had to leave the state. They didn't want him to darken their name any more than he already had. My uncle said they made sure he moved away. But apparently he snuck back at some point. Had been living a few counties over from us in secret. He asked what I was planning on doing about that daycare. I told him I'd obviously have to find a different site. Our scumbag family member was the only one in the surrounding area. But with a daycare center, one is too many. Right as I said that part, my uncle responded, "No, no, 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 no. You keep your daycare where it is. Me and your uncles will handle it." I asked what he meant by handle it. He told me not to worry. Within a week, I'd be able to hand in my completed daycare application without any child predators living in that area. I had a lot of uncles growing up. Very much a case of them not always being my uncles. When the uncle I spoke to said he was going to gather a bunch of them up so they could handle the situation, I was so naive I didn't hear that for what it was. When he called to say they'd handled it, my uncle added that I should probably wait a month or two before filing my application. They'd need to update the predator database to show he didn't live there anymore. Before I could do that, I happened to catch a very brief news story. An offender had gone missing a few counties over. Almost the exact place I wanted to open my daycare. When they said the guy's name, I realized it was him. Our scumbag relative hadn't moved. He disappeared. I asked my uncle what happened. What they did to make him disappear like that. All my uncle would say, they scared him so bad that he just up and vanished out of state. He'd show up again sometime in some faraway place. Just not anywhere near us. But sometimes I start to doubt he was telling me the truth. There's a little part of me that thinks they probably did something way worse than just talk to him. He wasn't just an offender. He was a legit child predator. Although I never personally checked, he apparently had convictions for a bunch of different stuff like that. One of the darkest parts of this whole thing, if my uncles did choose to take him out, I can't even say he doesn't deserve it. I got to open my daycare. To this day, I'm still living my dream and serving the community. While I've never told another living soul about what my family had to do to make sure I could open it, I can't keep it on my chest any longer. I need to say something important about this story and about what Zach did. What Zach did was not Islam. What ISIS does is not Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. The Quran is clear in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 32, "Whoever kills an innocent person, it is as if he has killed all of humanity. And whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved all of humanity." The Prophet Muhammad taught us to be merciful and just. He forbade the killing of women, children, and the elderly even in times of war. This is Islam. What Zach did. That's terrorism hiding behind a twisted interpretation of our faith. Groups like ISIS don't represent Islam any more than extremists represent any other religion. They prey on vulnerable young people who feel lost or angry. They radicalize them with propaganda and lies. My family is Muslim. We're peaceful. We love our neighbors. We contribute to our communities. And we're disgusted by what people like Zach do in the name of our religion. The overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world live peaceful values every single day. We're doctors, teachers, engineers, parents trying to make the world better. When terrorists claim they're acting for Islam, they're lying. They've betrayed everything Islam stands for. The biggest victims of ISIS? Other Muslims. So please understand, this is not a story about Islam being dangerous. This is about a young man radicalized by evil people who twisted a beautiful religion. Islam is not the threat. Extremism is the threat. Hatred and violence are the threat. And they exist everywhere. My aunt still prays 5 times a day. She still believes in Allah. But she mourns her real son. The boy who loved football and had his whole life ahead of him. That boy died the day he joined ISIS. Not because of Islam, but because he abandoned it. True Islam would have saved him. And that's what I want people to understand.